And today we're going to look at the archetype of Mars, Aries in the first house, which of course, as you can see here, active polarity, cardinal modality, and the fire element. One of the most basic archetypes of Mars, Aries first house, is of our conscious desire nature. In other words, we are acting upon desires that are emanating from our soul, represented by Pluto. And most of these desires coming from the soul have a tendency to be unconscious, subconscious, and they burst into the surface or into our conscious awareness via this planet sign and house that we are talking about. Now, the desire nature is always a dual desire nature, separating and returning. Separating desires are anything and everything you can think of in your manifestation in human form here on planet Earth. New job, new lover, a new purse, a new exercise routine, blah, blah, blah. It's not that these desires can't be returning as well, but it is the exhaustion of these separating desires that allows that desire to ponder why we're here and what's it all about, or that returning desire to know source. It allows it to become stronger, stronger, stronger as we exhaust the separating desires. So when we go through activity, with Mars, it can be the leading edge of the separating desires, but it can also be the leading edge of the returning desire as well. And that is something that, again, observe and correlate to see how it's manifesting for any specific individual soul. And so Mars is where we carry out all of those instinctive actions that are manifesting any of these emerging desires that are coming from the soul. Mars is also the archetype of initiation and new beginnings. It is the beginning of the circle. The ascendant degree or rising sign degree starts the beginning of the circle. That starts the beginning of that first house. So many of us know Aries as the first of the 12 archetypes. It will cover new beginnings. It's the symbol of that birthing process. In other words, every cycle has a beginning, and this is described by the energy of Mars. So what comes from this is compulsive and instinctual energy bursting forth. Active polarity, energy moving out from the center, cardinal modality, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, beginning something. So this also then will bring an extreme need for freedom, the freedom to instinctively act in any direction based upon what we are sensing from within us. That energy wants to be manifested, explored, fire element. Mars archetype is also the archetype of experience or experiences, or that process of creating life. We know Mars is action, so it's that need to actually live life, to do, to become, to act, versus just staying in our head and thinking about it. Now, if you have Mars in the sign of Libra or the sign of Gemini and it's the air element, it'll bring in some thinking, but it still is that instinctual need to actually act and experience something. And when we do that, what happens is we are going to discover something about ourselves that we didn't know before. Any of you who practicing astrologers, for instance, and have ever worked with someone who has Pluto in the first house, which is the soul, or even Mars itself in the first house, regardless of the sign, many times they can't hear you. Libra, psychology of listening, 7th house polarity. they don't really hear you. They have to live the experience, and through the reactions of that, that's how they go through that learning process. So they have to walk through it to become, to understand. And when there's any sense of restriction to that freedom to act however they want and experience whatever they want, of course, this creates that frustration and anger, because active polarity can't keep putting it out. Cardinal modality can't keep initiating. That fire element can't be spontaneous in its world. And something to recognize, and we'll look at this in a couple more slides here a little more, is it will create that sense of frustration both inwardly and outwardly. It'll create it within itself to have us wonder why we can't be free, and it'll be created outwardly by us, the Mars archetype, projecting the anger out onto someone else. It can also come from others, projecting anger back at the Mars archetype as well. More on this in a little bit. It is the archetype of personal self-discovery, which again is understood through action versus thought and concepts. Mars, Aries first house, can sometimes be called impulsive actions. And when we go through a Mars retrograde cycle, which we've got coming up this summer in Aquarius, Capricorn, Mars retrograde then has us reflecting on considered actions versus the impulsive action. So because of this personal self-discovery, this archetype is always in a continual process of becoming. There isn't that, say for instance, Taurus second house following Aries first. Taurus second house, is passive energy and that fixed modality. I want to stabilize. That is not the Martian energy. They are always wanting to move, be, act, become. So it has a tendency to create a very self-centered orientation. And one of the ways then that Mars Aries first house learns is they have an action followed by a reaction. And that reaction is that feedback from that polarity Libra seventh house. So there's an action followed by a reaction, which then leads to the next action, which leads to another reaction, and on and on and on that cycle goes. Act, react, act, react. So there tends to become then a continual feedback of who we are not. What we will also find is this Mars archetype can run into an identity crisis on a cyclic basis. And again, this process of personal self-discovery and this need to, initiate and create and do whatever we want to be living our life, it will from time to time run into a power stronger than itself. Someone else who will force that self-identity to actually look at itself. Sometimes we're open to that. Sometimes we're not open to that. It will also be that need for freedom to evolve, meeting the insecurity of the unknown. Again, this is going to be that cardinal modality of 2 steps forward till we get insecure, and then 1 step back into the past and security. That goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for this Mars archetype on a personal, internal basis as much as it does from the outer world giving feedback as well. So the identity crisis that will cyclically come up again, again, again. It can be created from outside pressure. It can be created from inside pressure or inside insecurity as well. It can come from within self. It can come from without via others. And as all this goes, back and forth, freedom, restriction, the Mars archetype will also vacillate between feeling all powerful, superhuman, that fire element where we have that, that sense of special destiny that EA talks about, and, bursting forth, I can do anything, versus whether it is outer or inner, coming back at it. It's like, oh, I can't do this. Someone else is more powerful than me. I have the insecurity of moving forward into that thing that I want to do, but I'm afraid to do. So this is quite common for Mars to go back and forth between feeling powerful and powerless. And what will happen here with this identity crises and that push out and that energy back in is it'll create a loss of perspective. They won't have a sense of self. They won't know who they are. And so when that loss of perspective about self comes along, it creates what we call that implosion. Everything that I just been talking about, the insecurity of moving forward will have us implode inward upon ourselves, running up against a greater outer power that resists will throw us back in upon ourselves. Again, these implosions are there so that on a cyclic basis, Mars Aries in the first house has to self-reflect. That's the purpose of implosion. As we look at the two polarities, active, passive, they are two halves of the circle. As you look at those 8 phases, which I'll show you a little later on here, and one phase is yang, the other phase is yin. One's energy moving out, the other's energy moving in. Same thing, when it goes inward, it gives us that opportunity to self-reflect. So even the Mars Aries first house archetype does self-reflection. And again, when we implode, it can be initiated by ourselves because we're having a crisis of self-identity. I don't know who I am. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to do. I don't know how it is I'm supposed to feel. I don't know how I'm supposed to act in this situation. And so what we then learn to recognize is that instinctual desire to evolve, those initiations that we're doing, those new beginnings that we're making, they aren't evolved. They aren't thought out. There isn't a plan. Any of you who've worked with someone who has a strong Mars archetype or a lot of planets in Aries in the first house, they don't operate from the ABC 1, 2, 3 plans and goals like the Capricorn energy will. They just instinctively go after it. So there has to be something that feeds back to help formulate again. This is Libra 7th house polarity. This is who I am. This is who I am not. This is what I want. This is what I don't want. So that there starts to be some evolution and growth over how they do identify with themselves from within themselves, and also by how they identify themselves with the universe, with others. So that archetype of implosion to self-reflect can also be forced upon them by the outer world, by the communications, feedback, actions of others, and by others in the universe who show up with more power than them, and therefore force them into various self-reflections. Of course, this will come through relationships, be it an intimate relationships, Libra 7th house polarity. It can come through the squares of Capricorn 10th in the work and career arena, an employer. It can come through the Cancer 4th house square with our family of origin. So all of the 4 quadrants can get activated in this implosion forced upon self when it's coming from the outside. Again, this will also create frustration and anger. How dare someone restrict me? How dare the universe not allow me to do what I want? Why can't I just do it? Why do I have to have this reflection upon myself? Then, of course, we can take it to its extremes here. And in that distortion, Mars, Aries in the first house will lead to violence. It's why this is the archetype that one of the archetypes that will relate to war in some of your more traditional astrologies. However, one of the most basic things that is coming at us, and this is going to be true whether that implosion and self-reflection is forced upon us or whether we go inward ourselves, initiating it ourselves. Either way, it is basically teaching us these lessons of equality and balance with others. Meaning even Mars, Aries in the first house has to learn it doesn't operate in isolation. It operates in relationship to all 11 other archetypes in the circle or the zodiac. It operates in relationship to all the other different types of situations and circumstances that can come up in the world of the human species. So something to recognize here again is that whatever ways are necessary, the universe will always provide the limitations and feedback that are basically to help us focus the initiation process. So that instinctual process of acting upon our desires has to learn how to evolve in harmony with others. Every other person also has Mars, Aries in the first house in their chart. They also have desire for freedom. They also have a desire for a personal self-discovery. They want to be and act just as much as we do. So how is that necessary ebb and flow of action and reaction going to bounce back and forth between the Mars archetype and the other in this gazillion different ways in which it will happen? All right, that's it. This is a fairly simple archetype to understand, but it can create all kinds of karma and issues and lessons when we don't want to listen to that Libra 7th house polarity, when we don't want to honor freedom to act to others as well. And again, as you look at this first archetype of the 4 quadrants, the other 3 quadrants can mix it up to create all kinds of situations and feedback with the universe. When the Mars archetype can evolve into understanding this implosion and self-reflection process is not a distortion. It's just a natural thing to do. You know, if we think about it, what goes up must come down, what goes out must come in. And so when we can learn to understand that natural part of this archetype, it can really calm down frustration and anger and allow for that intuitive instinct to act to just become more and more intuitive. You know, think of it as the Mars archetype going from consensus to individuated to spirituated. When we look at spirituated Mars, Aries, first house, there's a strong self-focus. There's a strong desire nature, but it's also starting to become more and more intuitively aware of the returning forces in the universe. And so it will instinctively act in harmony with those forces versus, say, someone who is in, you know, consensus Mars and just gets angry and frustrated and, you know, storms out of the room and, you know, has to go, you know, to the gym or the, you know, boxing class and just, you know, beat the energy out physically before they can even have any sense of self-reflection or processing through that feedback that will come from the universe. Okay, so if there's anything, any archetypes to Mars that you think I have missed or didn't explain, by all means, bring them up. Raise a question about it. I'll smooth it into what we've been speaking about here right now. At this point, I'm going to move into the slides that we look at every single month so that each one of these classes can be a standalone class. So thank you very much, those of you who tune in every month to repeat this. We're going to look at the basics of nodal axis astronomy first. And so North Node and South Node are points in space where the moon's path intersects with the plane of the ecliptic. The ecliptic we look at as the sun's apparent path around the Earth from our geocentric perspective, but it's really the Earth's actual path around the sun. And the North Node or ascending node is where the moon's path crosses above the ecliptic. South Node or descending node is where the moon's path crosses below the ecliptic. Here is a visual for you. As you can see, here's the sun and the ecliptic. Here's the moon's path, and as it moves here in this dotted line and goes south of the ecliptic or sun's apparent path, south node. 2 weeks later, the moon's path crosses north of this ecliptic with this dotted line, and we have the North Node. Now, twice a year, the sun's path and the moon's path will line up at the South Node, and we'll have the South Node eclipse season, which, by the way, happy new moon in Capricorn to all of you. We have 6 planets in Capricorn until the moon goes into Aquarius a little after midnight, early Wednesday, January 17th. But in 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a South Node lunar eclipse while the sun is lining up on the South Node in Aquarius. And then early mid-February, 2 weeks later, no, excuse me, full moons align up when the sun's on the south node and the moon's on the north node in mid-February. 6 months later, next summer, when the sun's traveling here along the north node in Leo, the moon will line up, and we're actually this year on the north node eclipse season going to have a solar eclipse, a lunar eclipse, and a solar eclipse. And I went into detail that in the 2018 forecast. If you haven't listened to that one yet, all 5 eclipses this year are active on Donald Trump's chart. And that North Node lunar eclipse in July will be very active on his chart. So just a little side point on how eclipses operate if you're not aware of that.